Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Ismi Mamlu'ah. I'm from T20196057. My ID number is T20196057. Today I would like to discuss about the expert concept. It is about translation. For the first, from Brahman Jacobson, The Nature of Linguistic Meaning and Equivalence. At the concept, there's three kinds of translation are to be differently labeled. For the first, intralingual translation, the second is interlingual translation, and the third is intersemiotic translation. Intralingual translation, we can see it as rewording is an interpretation of verbal sense by means of other sense of the same language, while interlingual translation is an interpretation of verbal signs by means of some other language. And intersemiotic translation is an interpretation of verbal sense by means of non-verbal sense system. But at this paper, at the book which I read, Rowan Jacobson itself just focus on interlingual translation. Jacobson goes on to examine key issues of this type of translation, notably linguistic meaning and equivalence. And then Jacobson follows the theory of language proposed by the famous Swiss linguist Saussure. At the concept of Saussure, Saussure distinguishes between the linguistic system, long and specific individual utterance, parallel. Central to his theory of language, he differentiates between the signifier and the signified, which together create the linguistic sense. Jacobson then moves on to consider the thorny problem of equivalence in meaning between words in different language. He points out that there is ordinarily no full equivalence between code units. Equivalence indifference is the cardinal problem of language and the pivotal concern of linguistics. Like any receiver of verbal message, the linguist acts as their interpreter. For the second one, the theory is from Nida. It discusses about the science of translating. Nida gave up the long-term use words throughout history, such as literal translation, free translation, and faithful translation. On the contrary, he advocated two equivalent ways as the basic direction and guidelines of translation. That is dynamic equivalence and formal equivalence. Nida suggested the main difference between those two was the purpose of the translation. For the first, dynamic equivalence. The most important thing in translation is the message received by the audience. Messages that are significant in both form and content need not only to be understood but also to be appreciated. And only when the translator could state the original features, he can achieve dynamic equivalence which stress the importance of transferring meaning, not grammatical form. While the former equivalence, it contrasts of dynamic equivalence. Formal equivalence focus on the need to pay attention to the form and content in the message. So, formal equivalence means that the message in the target language should be in accordance with the different parts in the original language. Okay, for the next point, the third concept. It is from Newmark, Semantic and Communicative Translation. According to Newmark, semantic translation attempts to render as closely as the semantic and the synthetic structures of the second language allow the exact contextual meaning of the original. Semantic translation has a source language bias. It is literal, and the loyalty is to the source tag author. It is more specific than the original in transferring nuance of meaning. Semantic translation relates to the word, or we can say the word group. On the other hand, for Newmark, communicative translation attempts to produce on its reader an effect as close as possible to the obtained on the reader of the original. Communicative translation has target language like free and idiomatic. It attempts to make the reading process easier for the target language reader who does not anticipate difficulties or obscurities and would expect a generous transfer of range elements into his own culture, as well as his language where necessary. It is likely to be smoother, simpler, clearer, more direct, more conventional, tending to translate. Communicative translation itself relates to the sentence. Okay, for the next, I would like to discuss for the last concept. It is from Kohler. Important work to refine the concept of equivalence was carried out by Kohler. Kohler's examined the concept of equivalence more closely along with its linked term, correspondence and equivalence. The two can be differentiated. So, these equivalence types are listed like denotative equivalence, connotative equivalence, text-normative equivalence, pragmatic equivalence, and formal equivalence. That's just I know from Kohler. For the meaning, denotative relate to equivalence of the extra-linguistic content of a text. Connotative related to lexical choice, especially between near synonyms. The text normative equivalence related to the text types with different kinds of text behaving in different ways. Pragmatic equivalence is oriented toward the receiver of the text or message, and the last formal equivalence related to the form and aesthetic of the text. I think that is just I know from Kohler concept. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.